welcome to another lovely session of Civil Engineering with Tanya J. Laird. I am the aforementioned Tanya J. Laird. This will be the 9th lecture in our wood design series. Today's video is accompanied by the lovely work of Felipe Sarro from his album Alkan. A link is included in the video description. This will be a relatively short video discussing the topic of species combinations found in the NDS and the NDS supplement. We're going to learn why species groups exist, how they're applied in the NDS provisions, and which grading agencies are responsible for the various species combinations. Let's consider two different tree species. Let's look at Douglas fir and western larch. So I'm going to just put up a few slides and we'll take a look at really what these species literally look like visually. So here you see what they look like in general. Here you see what their pine cones look like. Here you can see what their needles look like. And shown here are some figures on their mature sizes. Note here that it would be very rare to find a Douglas fir anywhere near that upper 8-foot diameter boundary, unless you're in some particular zones along the coast. And you're highly unlikely to be doing any kind of logging from those areas, as most are in protected regions and state and national parks, that sort of thing. So, looking back at these, again, looking at how they, I would encourage you here just to pause the video and look back at both their general appearance, looking at their pine cones, looking at their needles, and at their dimensions, so maybe you can see the problem. These two trees look an awfully lot like each other. They're both conifers that have similar overall appearance, dimensions, and details. These could be quite hard to tell apart. Well, I suppose that's not such a big deal. As long as they're not growing in the same areas, I suppose you should be able to tell them apart quite easily. Oh. What you see here is each species' natural range. On the left is the Douglas fir's growth range, and on the right is the western larch's growth range. The two different colors on the Doug fir's range indicate the coastal and mountain variants, so it seems that almost everywhere the western larch grows, Douglas fir also grows. This might be a problem. So, how can we handle cases like this? Now, don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying it's impossible to tell these two tree species apart. Even without using things like DNA testing, a skilled botanist, or really anyone with the right training, can tell them apart. If you're doing some woodworking and for some reason really want to work with western larch, rather than Douglas fir, you can find wood that is specifically it if you look hard enough, or if you contact a sawmill, that sort of thing. The point is not that it is impossible to tell these two tree species apart. The point is that it's difficult. Their natural range overlaps substantially, and they can be easily visually confused with one another. Oh, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but these two trees don't only look the same, they also have very similar mechanical properties such as strength, elastic modulus, etc. Imagine for a moment you run a timber company that owns a lot of forest land. You're harvesting a plot of land with both Douglas fir and western larch on it. For whatever reason, let's say you want to separate out the fir from the larch, and really you're doing this because you want to give your customers options. So you go to all the effort of separating all the fir from the larch so your customers know precisely what species they are buying. You do this, but of course you have to spend quite a lot of time and effort to properly identify them because they look so similar. So if you're the only lumber provider in the world, this wouldn't be a problem. But let's say there's another lumber company just down the road. They don't go to all the time and effort of separating out their Douglas fir from their western larch. They just put them both in one big pile and sell it as Douglas fir / larch. They don't mislead their customers, they don't sell them one thing they're labeling as another, they don't put out a big sign that says Doug fir and then mixed in that is both Doug fir and western larch, but they just sell them as a mixed pile. So, again, they just have a big pile that says, some of this is Doug fir, some of this is larch, or some of this is Western Larch. I haven't bothered sorting it out. Now, why would anyone purchase lumber from these guys? If you just think about this at a basic level, why would anyone purchase from the mixed lumber pile? Why would anyone go to your competitor with the mixed lumber pile when they could come to you and know exactly what they're buying? I mean, all things being equal, wouldn't a buyer like to know exactly which species they're buying? And yes, that is true. If all things were equal, no one would bother buying from your competitor's mixed pile of lumber than from your separated piles. But here's the key thing. Not all things are equal. Your competitor in this scenario has one enormous advantage over you, and that is what matters more than almost anything else in construction. That's cost. If you run a lumber company and want to sell all your Douglas fir and larch separately, you are going to have to pay people to sort them out. Now, this kind of sorting already does take place to a certain degree, but most tree species are much easier to tell apart. For example, with little to no training, someone can, in an instant, tell the difference between, say, Western cedar and Douglas fir. These are two species that look very different just by a quick glance. A single glance is all that's required to tell those two apart. Separating Douglas fir from Western larch, however, takes much more skill and effort. So if you're separating all of your Douglas fir from your Western larch, you're paying people to sort very similar things, and thus you're going to have to pass this cost on to your customers. Inevitably, your competitor will be able to sell their mixed pile of Douglas fir / larch much cheaper than you can sell your separated Douglas fir and separated Western larch. And think again about how most of this wood is going to be used. Most of this lumber you're selling is going to be used for structural purposes. That means that the vast majority of it is going to end up positioned behind drywall where no one will ever even see it. And even for cases where you have exposed wood members, say for example, glulam beams that are exposed for architectural reasons, again, remember, these two species look very similar. They have very similar grain patterns and appearance. It would take a skilled expert to tell the difference between, say, a wooden column made from Douglas fir or a wooden column made from Western larch. And neither has any real advantage on mechanical strength or any relevant property, or any property that's relevant to the construction industry. In short, as far as the construction industry is concerned, these two species of tree are indistinguishable. One is just as good as the other. They're not impossible to separate by a botanist or by a DNA test or by a trained person with a lot of experience, but they're difficult enough to simply not to be worth the effort. We can separate them, but it's simply not worth it. And this explains Table 2.1, a list of sawn lumber species combinations, and this is found in the NDS supplement. So if we scroll down here to the Douglas fir larch, we'll see that Douglas fir and Western larch are grouped together in a single species combination. Some other things to note, here, along with each of these combinations, there's also a grading rules agency and a table where the relevant design values appear. So, for example, the Douglas fir larch, this species combination has its grading defined by the WCLIB and the WWPA. All of the agencies that are listed here are various national or more commonly regional associations, associations of lumber mills, that sort of thing, trade groups, that sort of thing, that lay out specific standards for how each species combination is going to be graded. So for example, the WCLIB, that is the West Coast Lumber Inspection Bureau. The WWPA is the Western Wood Product Association, and the NELMA, NELMA, is the Northeastern Lumber Manufacturers Association. So there are many different regional and some international as well ratings agencies, and they specialize in the types of wood species and wood products that are sold in their respective regions. Also, a few other things to note. Do note that there are many different species combinations, and again, think back about how these are used commercially. these individual species are sold together, they're harvested together. You'll find these different species in the same regions on the same plots of land, and they'll be sold interchangeably even if you go to a big box store or something like that. If you go to a lumber yard or a big box store or whatever, you may find DFL lumber, Douglas fir larch lumber, sold together. Also be very careful when you're looking up properties, because some of these have very similar names. Douglas fir larch north and Douglas fir larch, these are not the exact same things. And if you go, now obviously they have some similar species, but they're different ratings provided by, or they're different families provided by different ratings and grading agencies. So the DFL regular is managed by the WCLIB and the WWPA, while the Douglas fir larch north is run by the NLGA. So you do have to be very careful with this in terms of what specific lumber product or lumber combination group that you're using. Otherwise, you could very well end up looking up the wrong mechanical properties when you're designing. So the DFL larch north and the DFL and just regular DFL, these have different grading rules, and as such, they will have different allowable stresses for bending stress, tension stress, etc. Also, another thing to note is that there are several different species combinations tables. So if you're working with solid sawn lumber, you're going to use table 2.1, at least for North American domestic species. But if you go past this to table 2.2, you'll find various international species in outside of North America, primarily in European countries. Some of these are included in the NDS here, or in the NDS supplement, and there are of course other species combinations that would be used, say, in East Asia, in parts of Africa, South America, things like that. The only reason you see primarily European species here is that these are the species that you might tend to see in North American construction contexts. Now, you're typically not going to build housing or something in a North American context out of anything other than North American lumber, unless you're talking about like finishes and things like that. Finishes, you can have all sorts of exotic woods, but in terms of just bog standard structural applications, you're unlikely to see anything except for regular North American lumber, and probably even lumber from your own region. It's usually just not worth the cost of, I mean, if I'm just going to make a structure out of wood and the wooden structure is going to be hidden behind drywall anyway, generally I wouldn't bother importing wood from another continent when I can get wood that is perfectly adequate for much lower cost in a nearby country. Or sorry, in my region, rather than importing from a far-off continent. So again, there's basically three tables that we need to consider. There's the one that we already looked at, table 2.1, which was the North American species for solid sawn lumber. 2.2 covers non-North American species, and then table 2.3 covers the species groups that are used in glulam combinations, and we will be working with this later in the series, later in our wood design series, when we look at glulam beams and their various laminations and their mechanical properties. So note that our solid sawn combinations are provided, their mechanical properties are provided in tables 4A, 4D, etc., tables in chapter 4, while our glulams are provided, the mechanical properties are provided in chapters 5. Alright, so I next wanted to take a look at this. This is standard number 17, put out by the West Coast Lumber Inspection Bureau back in 2018. And this is the actual standard developed by this agency for the purpose of rating species such as Douglas fir, hem fir, western red cedar, and other softwoods, including western larch, that sort of thing. Okay, so this is, as you can see by the number of pages, this is a 350-page document. This is not a simple process. This thing is just as involved as our wood design codes. So actually rating timbers and lumber in general can be very involved. So this is basically a very long document with a series of very specific rules for rating lumber of different types. So they'll have different grades for boards, for sheathing, framing lumber, surface, maybe things like facade lumber, that sort of thing. Whatever types, there are different rules for different species, different lumber products, etc. And there's also different rules for visual grading, for mechanical grading, etc. And as you may remember in the earlier in the series, we did discuss briefly visual grading versus mechanical grading. And visual grading is what's primarily used for your regular dimensional lumber. And so that will occur at the sawmill. You'll have an individual who is highly trained in the various requirements laid out in a standard like this, and or a series of individuals, and they will go and mark any given piece of wood, any given piece of timber according to a certain grade. And then each given piece of timber is assigned a grade stamp depending on what grade it falls within. And of course, generally the higher the grade, the higher the price. And so again, most is going to be visually graded, but in certain cases there are standards for mechanical grading, in which case they go and apply actual strength tests, and there are standards that are to be used for that. So I know this is quite the extensive document. There will be a link to this in the description of this video. So if you're curious to look at all the different types of standards all the different types of information. Here we go, stress grading, actual mechanical testing. They have certain standards that are certain methodologies that are to be used when measuring compression stress, parallel and perpendicular to grain, modulus elasticity, tension stress, etc. So if you want to use actual mechanical stress grading of your lumber for things like pre-manufactured wood trusses or pre-manufactured roof trusses, that sort of thing, you would use the procedures, and your sawmill was using lumber graded according to the standard, you would use some of the procedures laid out here. So again, I will put a link to this in the video description. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this because lumber grading, what I really just want to get at is that lumber grading can be an incredibly complex thing, and to be a truly experienced and skilled lumber grader is a profession unto itself. So we briefly discussed lumber grading in the scope of this course, but it should just be something you should I would like you just to walk away knowing that it is a very detailed and involved thing. So mostly in structural engineering, or structural engineers will see we'll look up a grade in a table and see a simple stress value and specify a certain kind of lumber grading, but the actual what actually goes into giving a given piece of lumber a specific grade stamp is quite an involved field. And with that, I think we'll wrap up here. This video is just meant to be a short discussion on the topic of lumber species combinations and grading agencies. As we saw in that lumber grading document, we could go into endless detail on this topic alone, but I do have to try to limit this already growing series somewhere. We're on lecture 9 and we haven't even gotten to our first calculation yet. On reflection, I think my fatal flaw is that what you might say, I'm addicted to context. Yeah, that's probably a good description. I'm pretty addicted to context. The world is endlessly complex and interconnected, and pulling one thread inevitably reveals many more. In the previous video, I mentioned this video would be a discussion of lumber sizes, but instead I fell down a rabbit hole of discussing species combinations. But don't worry, the species will eventually get where it's going. The next lecture, lecture 10, will in fact cover lumber sizes. Regardless, I hope you found this video interesting, or at least a bit informative. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to make the robots happy. If you would like to help make content like this possible, see the link to our Patreon page in the video description. Regardless, I'll see you all again in the next lecture. I look forward to seeing you all then, and as always, thank you.